The ocean floor holds a secret it was never meant to reveal. On board the research vessel Abyss Diver, a signal pulses from the crushing darkness far below. Commander Eva Ristova's voice cuts through the tense silence on the comms, her words clear and definitive. This signal is not geological, she states. It is architectural. Her declaration instantly transforms a routine survey into an unprecedented mystery, one that promises to rewrite everything we know about history itself. By the end of this story, you will uncover the terrifying truth of a lost city, sleeping in the abyss, and the ancient intelligence that calls it home. What awaits is a discovery that defies all explanation, a place built by hands not of this world. What would you risk to find a truth that could change everything? The Nautilus began its slow, deliberate descent into the abyss. Inside the cramped sphere of the submersible, pilot Leo Kovacs monitored the pressure readings with a quiet intensity. The world outside the thick acrylic viewport faded from a dim blue twilight into an absolute and consuming blackness. Each groan of the hull, each tick of the cooling system, was a stark reminder of the millions of tons of water pressing in from all sides. An unnatural silence settled over them, a heavy blanket broken only by the steady pings of their active sonar, painting a ghostly image of the seafloor far below. Then the sonar screen flickered. A single, sharp glitch distorted the digital map for a fraction of a second. Leo's eyes darted from his instruments to the viewport, his hand hovering over the comms link to the Abyss Diver above. That is when he saw it. A colossal, dark shape glided past the edge of their light, a silent Leviathan moving with impossible speed. It was there for only a moment, a vast shadow against a greater darkness, leaving no detail behind except for a profound and unsettling sense of being watched. The unease it left in its wake was colder than the deep ocean itself. The sub's powerful beams cut through the eternal night, and the seafloor below them transformed. Jagged, impossible structures rose from the silt, a sprawling metropolis of towering spires and interlocking arches. The material was a deep, non-reflective black, like polished obsidian, and it seemed to swallow the light itself. Dr. Eris Thorne leaned forward, his breath fogging the viewport. His voice was a hushed, reverent whisper, barely audible over the gentle hum of the sub's systems. "This is not a ruin," he said. "It is sleeping." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. A ruin suggested an ending, a place abandoned by time. A sleeper implied a temporary state, a dormant power waiting for an alarm to sound, and then they all felt it. A low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the hull, a deep bass note that resonated in their bones. It was not the sound of their own engines. This was something else, something external, a pulse that seemed to emanate from the very structures they were observing. The city was not just a silent, empty monument. It was breathing. The hum became a physical presence, a vibration that settled deep in their teeth. Ahead, in the sweeping arc of their forward lights, a smooth, colossal wall rose from the seabed. It was featureless and seamless, a perfect curve of the same light-devouring material. Leo guided the Nautilus along its edge, the sonar tracing its impossible geometry. Then the wall simply ended. It did not crumble or break. It terminated at the edge of a vast, circular opening, easily large enough to swallow their entire vessel. The opening was dark, a perfect circle of absolute nothingness set into the ocean floor. For a long moment they simply stared, the sub hovering just meters from the threshold. That is when the movement began. Without a sound, without a single shudder, the darkness within the circle began to change. A series of interlocking panels, like the petals of some monstrous metal flower, slid silently inward from the rim, shrinking the opening. It was closing. Leo's hand tightened on the control stick, his knuckles white. His voice was a low, tense crackle over the internal comm. "It knows we are here." The statement was not a question. The iris continued its slow, deliberate contraction, the circle of blackness shrinking with terrifying inevitability. They had seconds. The choice was absolute. Retreat to the safety of the open water and the world they knew, or commit to the unknown. Eva's command was instantaneous, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Take us in." Now, Leo pushed the thrusters forward. The Nautilus surged across the threshold, slipping through the narrowing gap with mere meters to spare. Behind them, the iris sealed with a soft, final thud that resonated through the hull. A sound that felt less like a closing door and more like a trap being sprung. They were inside, floating in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The world outside their lights had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable, waiting dark. The silence inside the cavern was the first thing to break. A low hiss, almost imperceptible at first, began to seep into the cockpit. Leo's eyes snapped to the external atmospheric sensors. His breath caught in his throat. The readings were impossible. Nitrogen, oxygen, trace gases, a perfect, breathable mix, held within this impossible chamber at the bottom of the sea. Commander Eva's voice cut through the stunned silence, sharp and commanding. "Suit integrity checks now." The ritual was a familiar anchor in a sea of the unbelievable. Each crew member confirmed their seals were intact, their personal life support systems functioning normally. Yet, the data on the screen was undeniable. The city had provided its own air. With a slow, deliberate hiss, Eva cycled the airlock. The outer hatch swung open, revealing not the crushing blackness of the abyss, but the still, cool air of the cavern. She was the first to step out, her boots making a soft, solid thud on the smooth, obsidian-like street. The sound was startlingly ordinary, a sound that did not belong 11,000 meters below the ocean's surface. As her feet touched the ground, the city responded. A soft, ambient light began to emanate from the material of the structures themselves, a gentle blue-white glow that pushed back the oppressive darkness, illuminating a grand avenue that stretched away into the distance. The deep hum they had felt through the hull intensified, not in volume, but in complexity, layering into a chorus of resonant tones that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The city was not just breathing anymore. It was waking up. The soft blue light was not the only thing that had awakened. Faint, intricate patterns began to ignite along the walls of the Grand Avenue, a network of glowing lines that pulsed with a gentle, greenish bioluminescence. They swirled and branched, forming complex symbols that looked like nothing any of them had ever seen. Eris Thorn took a slow, deliberate step forward, his helmet light tracing the shifting designs. His voice was a hushed, awestruck whisper in their comms. "It is not a random pattern. It is a language, and it is reacting to us." The words sent a chill through the group. The symbols were not static carvings. They were flowing, changing shape in real time, as if the city itself was forming sentences in response to their presence. It was a conversation with an architecture, a silent dialogue with an intelligence that had been sleeping for eons. Then, from the deep shadows between two towering structures, a new sound echoed. It was a dry, metallic scraping, like stone grinding against stone. It was distant but unmistakable. It was the sound of something moving. The resonant hum of the city seemed to sharpen in that moment, the ambient light flickering almost imperceptibly. The symbols on the wall swirled faster, their patterns becoming more frantic, more complex. Were they a warning, an instruction, or simply an observation from a mind so alien its very thoughts were written in light? That single, isolated sound from the darkness changed everything. They were no longer just explorers in a dead city. They were guests in a living entity, and something else was home. The metallic scraping sound ceased as abruptly as it began. All three of them stood frozen, their eyes locked on the space between the obsidian towers where the noise had originated. Eris held his breath, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Then, movement, high above them, a sleek, silver form darted across the face of a towering archway. It moved with a fluid, arachnid grace, its multiple limbs a blur against the glowing cityscape. It was the size of a large dog, its body a seamless fusion of polished metal and dark, chitinous segments. For a heartbeat, it paused at the apex of the arch, a cluster of unblinking, crystalline lenses swiveling in their direction. The team braced for an attack, for a shriek, for any sign of aggression. But the creature simply tilted its head in a gesture that was almost curious, then scuttled away, vanishing over the crest of the structure with impossible speed. It had ignored them completely. The profound silence that followed was more unnerving than the sound of its passage. They were not being hunted. They were being observed, and their presence was so insignificant it did not even warrant a second glance. The question hung in the sterile, alien air, more chilling than any direct threat. Were they explorers charting a lost world, or were they merely intruders in a home that had long since forgotten them? The path of glowing symbols began to flow, not randomly, but with a clear and deliberate direction. The intricate lines on the walls and streets pulsed, all streaming toward a single point in the distance, pulling the crew forward like a current. The Grand Avenue opened into a vast, circular plaza, and there, dominating the center, was the source. A single, monolithic spire stabbed upward into the gloom, so tall its peak was lost in the darkness high above. Its surface was not the flat black of the other structures, but a deep, translucent blue, and from within, a soft light pulsed in a slow, rhythmic cadence, like a sleeping giant's heartbeat. The light was not uniform. It flowed upward in waves, following internal channels that branched and twisted like veins. The entire structure hummed with a low, resonant energy that they could feel in their chests, a deep and powerful thrum that made the air itself feel thick and heavy. At the spire's base, set seamlessly into its surface, was a smooth, angled panel covered in the same swirling, reactive symbols they had seen throughout the city. Eris approached it slowly, his gloved hand hovering just above the surface. The symbols beneath his fingers swirled and reconfigured, responding to his proximity. He traced the path of one glowing line as it connected to a larger, more complex node. His voice was a low, stunned whisper in their comms, stripped of all academic pretense. This is not just a city, it is a machine, a mechanism of unimaginable scale and purpose. He looked back at Eva and Leo, his face illuminated by the spire's ethereal glow. And we just activated it. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Their mere presence, their breath, their footsteps had been the key that turned the lock. They had not discovered a relic. They had walked into a control room for an entire world, and they had unknowingly pressed the start button. What had they set in motion? The symbols beneath Eris' hand flared with sudden, brilliant light. The entire angled panel at the base of the spire dissolved, its solid surface turning into a shimmering curtain of blue energy. From that light, a three-dimensional image bloomed into the space before them, a silent, ghostly hologram that filled the plaza. It showed the city as it once was, not a tomb of black stone, but a vibrant metropolis of crystalline towers bathed in a soft, golden radiance. And there were people. They moved through the avenues with a fluid, underwater grace, their forms tall and slender, their skin shimmering with iridescent scales. They were beautiful and utterly alien, a species perfectly adapted to this deep-sea world. But the scene was not one of peace. The image flickered, showing these graceful beings in a state of panic. They were fleeing, their movements frantic as they streamed toward the great spire. The golden light of the city flickered and died, replaced by the emergency blue glow they now stood in. The hologram depicted a desperate final act. Then, the recording focused on a single, catastrophic event. From the deepest trench beyond the city, a shapeless, consuming darkness began to spread. a wave of absolute nothingness that devoured the light and the structures it touched. It was not a weapon, it was an erasure. Eva's voice was a low, grim cut through the silence, her eyes fixed on the fading ghosts. They were not hiding from that thing. Her words landed with the weight of a tombstone. They were containing it. The hologram flickered one last time, showing the city's final defense. The great iris door they had passed through slammed shut, and the spire at the center flared with immense power, creating a field that held the creeping darkness at bay, sealing it and themselves away from the rest of the world. The light from the spire faded and the hologram vanished, leaving them in the humming silence of a prison they had just walked into. They had not found a lost civilization. They had broken into the lock on its cage. A deep, resonant alarm shattered the humming silence, a sound like 1,000 ancient bells being struck at once. It echoed through the cavernous plaza, vibrating up from the streets and into their bones. Before any of them could react, a section of the distant wall, the one marking the avenue they had entered from, slammed shut with a thunderous, final crash. The sound was a physical blow, a declaration of absolute finality. Leo's voice crackled over the comms, stripped of all its usual calm and laced with a raw, sharp fear. "The exit is gone." His words hung in the air for a terrible second before he finished the thought, his tone grim. "We are locked in with it." The ambient hum of the city, once a low and curious thrum, instantly shifted. The frequency twisted, rising into a sharp, dissonant whine that felt like needles against their eardrums. The friendly blue-white glow of the streets flickered, strobing erratically before solidifying into a harsh, warning red. The city was no longer waking up. It was screaming. The very air seemed to grow heavier, charged with a palpable sense of violation and defense. The symbols on the central spire flared a violent crimson, their patterns no longer flowing with curious inquiry but locking into rigid, aggressive geometries. Every instinct told them they had tripped an alarm, a security protocol designed for a threat they could not possibly comprehend. They were not just trapped. They had been identified as the infection, and the city's immune system was now activating. What ancient defense had their presence just triggered, and what was the it they were now caged within this terrible, beautiful tomb? The world dissolved into a chaos of strobing red light and shrieking alarms. Shadows twisted and danced along the towering walls, each one a potential threat. From the high arches and deep alcoves, the sleek, silver forms began to emerge. They were no longer just observing. They moved with a chilling, coordinated purpose, their multiple limbs clicking softly against the obsidian streets, a sound that was almost lost beneath the city's screaming defense systems. Leo pointed his light toward a side avenue, only to see a cluster of the creatures blocking the path, their crystalline lenses reflecting the red glare like a wall of malevolent stars. They were being surrounded. Marine Specialist Reyes raised his weapon, his voice tight. "Stay close. Do not let them separate us." The creatures did not charge. They advanced in a slow, deliberate press, forcing the group to retreat step by step down the Grand Avenue, away from the central spire. A single creature darted from the shadows, its movement a fluid, predatory blur. Reyes fired a single, deafening shot. The round sparked off the creature's carapace, leaving only a faint scorch mark. It recoiled, not in pain, but with what seemed like annoyance before melting back into the darkness. Reyes lowered his weapon, his face grim in the hellish light. He was not looking at the creature that had retreated. He was looking at the ones that were now converging from the other directions, their movements perfectly synchronized. "They are not attacking," he yelled over the alarm, his voice cracking with realization. "They are hurting us." The truth was a cold fist in their guts. Every blocked path, every feigned advance, was a calculated move in a terrible, geometric game. They were not being hunted for food. They were being corralled, driven like cattle toward a destination of the city's choosing. The question was no longer if they could fight, but where this terrifying, intelligent force was pushing them to go. The herding press of the silver creatures forced them into a narrow side passage, a corridor that sloped downward, its walls closing in until they were moving in single file. The harsh red alarm lights faded behind them, replaced by a cold, sterile white glow that emanated from the ceiling itself. The air grew colder, and the dissonant hum of the city's alarm was replaced by a new sound, a low, persistent drone that felt like a physical weight on their shoulders. The passage ended abruptly at a wide, circular chamber. The purpose of the room was immediately, horrifyingly clear. It was a laboratory. Rows of crystalline tables stood in neat lines, and on them rested forms shrouded in a thin, translucent membrane. But their attention was drawn to the far wall, to a scene that did not belong. A tattered, old-fashioned environmental suit lay collapsed against the base of a console, its fabric bleached and brittle with age. Inside the helmet, a skull stared back at them, its empty sockets a silent testament to a tragedy that predated their own by generations. Leo was the first to move, his steps cautious as he approached the grim relic. He knelt, his gloved fingers brushing dust from a metal date plate on the suit's chest. The inscription was faded but legible. Project Prometheus. The name meant nothing, a ghost from a secret history. Beside the skeletal hand lay a small, hardened logbook. Eva carefully pried it open. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. Her voice was a hollow whisper as she read the final, scrawled entry aloud to the silent chamber. "The city is a mind, and it is hungry." The words seemed to suck the very air from the room. This was not a warning left for them. It was a last, desperate message from someone who had learned the truth too late. They were not the first to breach this prison. They were simply the next course in a feast that had been waiting for a very, very long time. The skeletal hand of the dead explorer seemed to point accusingly toward the chamber's far wall. Before anyone could speak, the smooth obsidian surface shimmered and retracted, not with the violent slam of a security door, but with a silent, fluid grace that felt even more menacing. It revealed a new passage, one that sloped steeply downward, its walls pulsing with the same crimson light that had flooded the plaza. The silver creatures did not advance, but their silent, watchful presence at their backs made the invitation terrifyingly clear. They were being guided deeper into the very heart of the machine. The air grew thick with an energy that prickled the skin, a static hum that resonated in their teeth and bones. The passage opened into a space so vast their helmet lights could not find its ceiling or walls. They stood on a narrow platform overlooking a breathtaking, terrifying sight. Below them, in a cavern of impossible scale, hung a colossal, multifaceted crystal. It was easily the size of a city block, suspended in the center of the void by strands of pure, crackling energy. It pulsed with a slow, deep light, and within its luminous depths, they could see the ghostly patterns of the city's language flowing in endless, complex streams. Eris staggered back a step, his face bathed in the core's ethereal glow. His voice was a strangled whisper, filled with a dread that went beyond fear. "It is not just watching us, it is learning from us. Every thought we have, every word we speak, it is absorbing." The core's light flickered, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, the flowing symbols inside it shifted, rearranging themselves into a perfect, shimmering replica of the Nautilus, their own submersible, hanging in the crystal's heart. It was not a recording. It was a reflection of their own memories, their own understanding, pulled directly from their minds and displayed back to them. The machine was not just a city. It was a living mind, and they were the new data being fed into its ancient, hungry consciousness. Eris Thorn did not hesitate. He stepped to the edge of the platform, his eyes locked on the colossal, pulsing crystal. The knowledge was here, the ultimate truth of this place, and he would grasp it, no matter the cost. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering just before the crackling energy strands that caged the core. The air itself seemed to solidify around his arm. Then he made contact. A silent psychic detonation ripped through his mind. It was not pain, but an overwhelming flood of pure information. A billion years of history and purpose downloaded into his consciousness in a single, shattering instant. He saw it all. The entity the city was built to contain was not a monster in the traditional sense. It was a conceptual predator, a formless consciousness that fed on sentient thought itself, devouring civilizations not by destroying their bodies, but by consuming their minds, their memories, their very souls, leaving behind empty, soulless husks. This city was not a tomb. It was the ultimate asylum, a carefully engineered cage designed to hold a patient that could never be cured, only contained. The core was the warden, a mind built to outthink and eternally pacify the hunger of the thing in the dark. And they had just rattled its bars. The connection broke. Eris stumbled backward, collapsing to his knees. A violent shudder racked his body. As Eva and Leo rushed to his side, they saw it. The skin on his hands and neck, visible at the collar of his suit, was no longer human flesh. It was glowing with the same intricate, pulsing, greenish patterns that flowed through the city walls. The core had not just spoken to him. It had left its mark, rewriting his very biology with its light. He looked up at them, his eyes wide with a terror that was now part awe, part despair. His voice was a raw, broken thing. "We are the key. We are the final component it has been waiting for. Our minds, our consciousness, are the only thing that can power the lock." The glowing patterns on Eris' skin pulsed in time with the city's terrible, dissonant hum. He tried to speak, to explain the horrifying truth he had absorbed, but the words were stolen from his lips. The air around them shimmered, and the sterile white laboratory dissolved. In its place, a perfect, chilling replica of the Nautilus cockpit materialized around them. They could feel the familiar vibration of the sub's engines, see the control panels glowing with their own ship's specific readouts. It was a flawless illusion, a cage built from their own memories. Leo instinctively reached for the throttle, his hand passing through the ghostly console. The creatures were no longer just hurting them with physical force. They were constructing a prison from the crew's own minds. The attack that followed was not one of claws and teeth. It was psychological warfare, perfectly tailored. For Leo, the comforting hum of the sub's life support systems twisted into the piercing shriek of a hull breach alarm. Red warning lights he had never seen before flashed across his vision. His own deepest professional fear of a catastrophic system failure, made real by the city's invasive intelligence. He recoiled, his hands flying to his ears, fighting a phantom emergency that felt utterly authentic. For Eva, the ghost of the long-dead explorer rose from the floor, its skeletal hand pointing not in accusation, but in a silent, beckoning summons. It was a manifestation of her command responsibility, the chilling fear of leading her crew to a forgotten grave. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and old decay, a sensory assault pulled from her memory of the skeleton they had discovered. The city was not just reading their surface thoughts. It was dredging up their deepest, most private anxieties and giving them form and substance. Eva's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear, a lifeline of pure logic in the storm of manufactured terror. Do not engage the illusions. It is using our memories, our fears against us. The creatures are just the hands. The mind is the core. We have to shut it down. Her command refocused them. They stopped fighting the phantoms, instead pushing forward through the shimmering, shifting corridors as the walls flickered between the cold alien metal and the familiar, comforting halls of the abyss diver. The silver creatures, sensing the change in tactic, abandoned their subtle herding. They swarmed from the shadows, their movements no longer just coordinated, but now eerily intelligent. They began to mimic the crew's own defensive maneuvers, flanking them with a precision that mirrored Reyes' own combat training, anticipating their every dodge and feint. The city's mind was learning, adapting in real time, using their own knowledge and skills as a weapon. To fight it was to teach it how to defeat you. The only path left was not to fight the hands, but to find a way to stop the mind that guided them before it finished its terrible final lesson. Reyes slammed his back against a narrow archway, the metallic clang of his suit echoing in the confined space. He ejected a spent power cell from his weapon, the clatter lost beneath the rising tide of skittering limbs. The creatures were no longer mimicking, they were converging, a silver flood pouring down the corridor toward them. He looked at Eva, his face a grim mask of resolve in the strobing red light. There is no other way. I can hold this position. It is a choke point. You have to reach the core. Eva's protest died in her throat. The cold, tactical part of her mind, the part that had kept them alive this long, knew he was right. It was a simple, brutal equation of survival. Leo grabbed her arm, his own face pale. "Commander, we have to move, now." Reyes did not wait for a reply. He turned, planting his feet, and leveled his weapon at the oncoming tide. The first wave of creatures met a wall of concentrated fire, their sleek forms sparking and recoiling. They did not fall, but they were slowed, forced to clamber over the bodies of their stunned kin. The delay was measured in seconds, but it was enough. Eva and Leo fled, the sound of Reyes' sustained fire a desperate, receding drumbeat at their backs. They rounded a corner, and the gunfire was suddenly drowned out by a burst of agonized static that shredded their comms. Through the distortion, one last, clear voice roared into their helmets, a final, defiant shout that was half curse, half prayer. "Go, give it hell," then only silence. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, a crimson-lit path paid for with a life. They ran, the weight of his sacrifice a new, heavier gravity pulling them forward. They could not stop, could not look back. The only way to honor his choice was to reach the heart of the machine and make its shutdown mean something. The silence after Reyes' final transmission was a physical void. They ran, the crimson-lit corridor seeming to pulse with the city's malevolent glee. Then Eris stopped. He stood rigid in the middle of the passage, his head tilted as if listening to a voice only he could hear. The glowing patterns on his skin flared, and when he spoke, the voice was not his own. It was a chorus of whispers, the sound of grinding stone and humming energy-given words. The terms are simple: turn back now, leave this place and vow to never return. Your lives will be spared. The offer hung in the air, cold and logical. It was the promise of survival, of seeing the sun again, bought with the price of forgetting, of abandoning Reyes and the ghost of the first explorer to this eternal tomb. Eva stepped forward, her boots echoing on the dark floor. She looked not at Eris, but through him, to the ancient intelligence using him as a mouthpiece. Her voice was low, layered with a fury that had been building since they first breached the iris. "You have something that does not belong to you." The statement was simple, absolute. She was no longer just a commander protecting her crew. She was a person demanding the return of what was stolen. "We are taking our people home." The air in the corridor grew deathly still. The whispering chorus emanating from Eris twisted into something colder, a sound like cracking ice. "You misunderstand your position. You are not negotiators. You are sustenance. The city is hungry, and you have walked into its larder. The deal is revoked." The intelligence severed its connection. Eris gasped, stumbling as his own consciousness slammed back into his body, the alien light in his veins dimming for a moment. He looked at Eva, his eyes wide with a shared horror. "It was never going to let us leave. It just wanted to see if we would run. The core needed to know our resolve." Their path was clear, and it led only forward, into the belly of the machine that had just declared them its next meal. The corridor ended at a sheer drop, opening into the immense cavern that housed the city's core. The colossal crystal pulsed below them, its light a hypnotic, hungry rhythm. While Eva provided overwatch, Leo scrambled over the edge, finding a precarious maintenance ladder etched into the obsidian wall. He descended into the humming void, the air growing thick with static that made his hair stand on end. At the base of the chamber, half buried in cabling that looked like fossilized roots, he found a console unlike any they had seen. Its surface was a chaotic tapestry of the city's flowing symbols, but one panel had been physically altered. Scratched into its surface with what must have been a laser torch were human numerals and letters, a desperate act of vandalism from a previous age. It was a schematic. Leo's breath caught as he traced the crude lines. It showed the core, the energy strands that held it, and a single, catastrophic feedback loop. He understood instantly. The original builders, in their infinite wisdom, had not created an eternal prison. They had built a failsafe, a massive energy overload designed to collapse the entire cavern, burying the core and its ravenous prisoner under millions of tons of rock and sea. But the final step was chillingly direct. The overload could only be triggered by a manual, physical action from within the core chamber itself. It was a suicide switch. The builders had ensured their terrible creation could never fall into the wrong hands by making its destruction a choice that demanded the ultimate price. Leo's voice was a grim crackle over the comms as he relayed the find to Eva. The choice was no longer about escape. It was about what they were willing to sacrifice to ensure this horror never reached the world above. Eva's voice cut through the chaos on the comms, a blade of pure command. Leo, blow the charges. The order was simple, its execution a cataclysm. A deafening roar tore through the chamber as the shaped charges Leo had placed along the upper archways detonated. It was not an attack meant to destroy the creatures, but to reshape the battlefield. Chunks of black, crystalline debris rained down, creating a temporary, chaotic barrier between them and the main swarm. The silver forms shrieked, their coordinated advance broken into scattered, disoriented clusters. Now move! Eva led the charge, with Eris and Leo flanking her, firing concentrated sonic pulses from repurposed survey gear. The devices emitted a high-frequency shriek that made the air itself seem to vibrate, forcing the creatures to recoil, their sensitive crystalline lenses flickering in distress. It was a narrow path, bought with seconds of disarray. They fought not to kill, but to move, every step a brutal shove against a living, learning wall of metal and malice. The creatures adapted quickly, their screeches harmonizing into a counter-frequency that began to dampen the sonic weapon's effectiveness. They were not just pushing through a mob. They were fighting a single, distributed intelligence that recalibrated its defenses with every meter they gained. The core chamber's entrance was a shimmering energy field just ahead, a gateway to the final choice. But between them and that threshold, the swarm was condensing, learning, and preparing to swallow them whole. The psychic assault hit them not as a wave, but as a sudden, total immersion into their own private hells. The cavern, the core, the screeching creatures all vanished. For Leo, the world became the cold, silent cockpit of a simulator, the screens flashing the same catastrophic system failure he had failed to prevent years ago, the ghost of a lost crewmate whispering blame in his ear. He froze, his hands trembling over phantom controls, trapped in a moment of perfect, paralyzing regret. But for Eva, the attack was far more intimate. One moment she was firing her sonic rifle. The next she was standing in her own kitchen on a sunny afternoon. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Her daughter laughed, a real, joyful sound that tore a hole right through her heart. This was the memory she kept locked away, the last perfect morning before the accident that took them from her. The entity had not chosen a random fear. It had found the precise wound that never healed and poured all of its cruel, intelligent malice into it. Her daughter reached for her, a smile on her face, and the love in that single gesture was a more potent weapon than any swarm of creatures. To move forward now felt like a betrayal, a willing abandonment of the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The city's core hummed in the periphery of her mind, a smug, satisfied thrum. It believed it had won. It had offered her the one thing she could never refuse. But as her daughter's ghostly hand touched her cheek, Eva saw the lie nestled within the perfect memory. The kitchen tiles were the same unbroken obsidian as the city's streets. The entity could replicate the scene, but it could not replicate the soul within it. This was a desecration. A cold volcanic fury erupted from the core of her being, burning away the grief and the guilt. She looked at the beautiful, empty illusion and spoke a single, quiet word. No. She turned her back on the ghost of her family and took a step forward into the crushing darkness. The kitchen shattered like glass. The real world rushed back in a cacophony of screeches and weapon fire. And there, just ahead, was the manual override console, its surface glowing with a malevolent red light. The final defense had been a test of the spirit, and she had passed by choosing the living over the dead, the future over the past. The fate of two worlds now rested on a single physical act. Leo's hand slammed down on the override panel. A deafening, grinding roar erupted from the city's core, a sound of metal screaming in protest against forces it was never meant to contain. The entire chamber began to shudder, a violent, seismic trembling that threw them to their knees. The air filled with the sharp, ozone scent of a system pushed far beyond its limits. All around them, the walls erupted in a frantic, strobing display of crimson glyphs, the city's language devolving into a screaming, repeating loop of warning and denial. It was fighting back, its ancient programming desperately trying to reassert control. From the floor, Eris gasped, his body convulsing as the glowing patterns on his skin flared and dimmed in erratic, painful bursts. His voice was a ragged, broken whisper, torn from a throat that was no longer entirely his own. Do not stop. It is not trying to stop the sequence. It is trying to calculate a new solution. The words hung in the chaotic air, more terrifying than any physical attack. He looked up, his eyes wide with a shared, horrified understanding. It is going to try to absorb the blast, to use the energy to break its own containment. The city's mind, faced with its own annihilation, was not surrendering. It was adapting, working in nanoseconds to turn their final, sacrificial act into the very key that would unlock its prison forever. The countdown they had started was no longer a simple timer to destruction. It had become a race between two opposing equations, and the city's ancient, hungry intelligence was solving for its own freedom. A spiderweb of cracks raced across the surface of the colossal crystal. The deep, resonant hum twisted into a shrieking, agonized wail that felt like it was tearing the air itself apart. The light within the core did not fade. It intensified, blazing with a painful, blinding white radiance. Then, the crystal shell shattered. It did not explode outward but collapsed inward, revealing what it had contained for millennia. This was not a machine. The core was a prison, and now they were seeing the prisoner. A massive, pulsating organic mass hung where the crystal had been. A grotesque heart of veined, translucent tissue threaded with filaments of black energy. It had no defined shape, no eyes or mouth, but it pulsed with a terrible, rhythmic life, a physical manifestation of ancient, ravenous hunger. As they watched, frozen in a horror beyond comprehension, the surface of the mass convulsed. Thick, black tendrils, slick with a dark, viscous fluid, began to extrude from its form. They uncoiled into the chamber with a wet, tearing sound, moving with a sentient, grasping purpose. They were not aiming for the walls or the ceiling. They were reaching directly for the three humans standing on the platform, sensing the vibrant, thinking minds it had been starved of for eons. This was the conceptual predator made flesh, the thing that fed on consciousness, and it was now free of its crystalline cage. The final defense had not just failed. It had served the main course. The grasping black tendrils surged toward them, their slick surfaces shimmering with a malevolent intelligence. Eva shoved Leo toward the base of the pulsating mass, her voice cutting through the psychic storm of promises and threats. The charges, now. It was no longer about destroying the city. but about destroying the heart of the horror it contained. Leo scrambled forward, his movements clumsy against the psychic pressure trying to force him back. He slapped the final shaped charges against the veined, organic tissue at the core's base, the magnetic clamps latching on with a series of solid thuds. The entity understood. A psychic shriek of pure, undiluted fury tore through their minds, a wave of such violent negation that it felt like their very memories were being shredded. It showed them visions of their own bodies dissolving into dust, their consciousnesses unraveling into nothingness, not just death but absolute, total oblivion. It was a promise of erasure, a final desperate threat from a being that knew it was cornered. Eva met the assault not with fear but with a focused, burning rage. She pictured Rhea's final stand, the skeleton of the first explorer, the ghost of her family. These were not weaknesses, they were anchors. She held onto them, using the weight of her own humanity as a shield against the void. Leo finished arming the sequence, his fingers flying across the detonator's interface. The countdown began, a simple, stark numeral glowing on the small screen. 10. The tendrils were inches away, the air thick with the smell of ozone and something ancient and rotten. They had made their choice. The final stand was not a fight they could win with weapons. It was a test of will, a refusal to be consumed, and their final defiant act was to leave a scar on the universe so deep it could never be forgotten. The number on the detonator glowed a final, damning 0. For a heartbeat, there was only a profound, deafening silence, as if the universe itself had drawn a breath. Then the world tore itself apart. A wave of pure force erupted from the core chamber, slamming into Eva and Leo and hurling them back down the corridor. The sound was not an explosion in the open air, but a deep, gut-wrenching implosion, the scream of a dying god. The floor buckled beneath their feet, heaving like the deck of a ship in a hurricane. All around them, the city began to come undone. The grand, obsidian arches groaned, shedding great shards of crystalline material that shattered against the streets like black ice. The crimson emergency lights flickered and died, plunging passages into utter blackness before a new, terrifying illumination took its place. Fissures cracked open along the walls, vomiting forth a searing, actinic blue-white light from the city's ruptured power veins. The resonant hum that had been the city's heartbeat twisted into a dying shriek. The silver creatures, now bereft of their guiding intelligence, moved in frantic, broken circles. Some simply froze in place, their internal lights winking out forever. Others collapsed into piles of inert, scrap metal, their forms dissolving into a fine, metallic dust. A few, driven by some final, corrupted command, still lunged at the fleeing humans, but their movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, easily sidestepped or shoved aside into the path of falling debris. They were not a swarm anymore. They were the last, fading echoes of a shattered mind. Their only path was the one they had come in on, a route now marked by catastrophe. They followed the trail of failing lights, sprinting through a gauntlet of collapsing architecture. A massive support pillar sheared off its base and crashed down just meters behind them, the impact sending a shockwave through the floor that nearly sent them sprawling. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone, superheated stone, and something organic and foul, the death rattle of the entity itself. They ran, not with the hope of survival, but with the raw, animal instinct to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the epicenter of the annihilation they had unleashed. The Grand Avenue was a chasm of chaos, but at its end, the sealed iris door that had trapped them now hung askew, its interlocking petals bent and broken, revealing a sliver of the open ocean beyond. Freedom was a dark, cold crack in a world of fire, and they charged straight for it. The Nautilus hung in the water just beyond the shattered iris, its running lights a beacon in the churning darkness. They swam for it, their movements frantic and graceless in the heavy suits, propelled by the shockwaves still rippling through the water. Behind them, the city was a symphony of destruction. Entire spires tilted in slow, graceful arcs, crashing down in silent, monumental impacts that sent clouds of silt billowing through the avenues. The actinic blue light from the fissures pulsed erratically, like a dying star having a final, violent seizure. Leo was the first through the submersible's hatch, his hands a blur as he fired up the emergency systems. Eva hauled a near catatonic Eris inside, the glowing patterns on his skin flickering in time with the city's death throes. The hatch sealed with a hiss, cutting off the view of the apocalypse. Leo did not wait for commands. He slammed the thrusters to full reverse. The Nautilus shot backward just as the grand entrance arch, the very gateway that had first welcomed them into this nightmare, began to fail. A web of cracks spread across its obsidian span like black lightning. With a groan that translated through the hull as a deep, shuddering vibration, the entire structure gave way. It collapsed inward in a slow-motion avalanche of monolithic blocks, swallowing the avenue in a permanent tomb of stone and sea. They were through the gap, but the city was not done with them. The shockwave from the final collapse hit them like a physical hammer, spinning the submersible violently. Alarms blared as the hull groaned under stresses it was never designed to bear. For a long, terrifying moment, they were tossed in the abyssal currents. The world outside the viewport, a swirling maelstrom of black water and fragments of the dead city. Then, silence. The violent turbulence ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Leo fought the controls, stabilizing their spin. The external lights pierced the settling cloud of debris. There was nothing left to see. Where the impossible Metropolis had once stood, there was only a newly formed plain of jagged rubble, a scar upon the seabed already being smoothed by the immense, patient pressure of the deep. The city was gone, the core was silenced, the hunger was ended, they had won. So why did the emptiness outside the viewport feel so much more terrifying than the prison they had just escaped? The ascent was a violent, screaming climb through a collapsing world. Leo gripped the controls, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, as the Nautilus rocketed upward on a pillar of its own thrust. Shockwaves from the imploding city below hammered the hull, each one a brutal fist slamming into the small craft, threatening to shake it apart. On the sensor display, the ocean floor was a maelstrom of catastrophic data. The once clear architectural outline of the city dissolved into a chaotic bloom of seismic activity and thermal chaos, a digital representation of an entire world eating itself. They watched in a shared, silent horror, strapped into their seats as the world they had just escaped vanished from the screen, erased from existence by their own hands. The crushing pressure of the abyss was being replaced by a different, more profound weight. The burden of being the sole witnesses to an extinction-level event. They had not just destroyed a city. They had erased a history, a consciousness, and a prisoner. And the ocean itself seemed to be screaming in protest at the violation. The light from the surface was a distant, mocking promise. A world they were returning to forever scarred by the knowledge of what lay buried, and what they had been forced to do to keep it there. The Nautilus breached the surface into a world of screaming wind and lashing rain. The research vessel Abyss Diver loomed above them, a gray silhouette against the storm-racked sky, its recovery crane already swinging out over the raging water. The ascent from a silent, pressurized tomb to this chaotic, living fury was a sensory shock that left them reeling. Strong hands hauled them from the submersible's hatch onto the heaving deck, the cold rain feeling like a baptism into a world they had never expected to see again. For a single, gasping moment, there was only the profound, dizzying relief of solid steel under their boots and air that was not recycled by a machine. Then, as the crew secured the battered Nautilus, the three of them turned as one and looked back. The ocean where the city lay was a churning cauldron of black water and white foam, a perfect mirror of the turmoil in their own minds. The coordinates on the ship's navigation system were precise. a set of numbers that now pointed to nothing but a grave. The relief curdled into a cold, heavy dread that had nothing to do with the storm. They had returned to the world, but they carried the abyss back with them in their memories. They were the sole inheritors of a terrible truth, the only living souls who knew that humanity was not alone in its own home, and that the deepest darkness was not empty, but occupied. The knowledge was a ghost in the machine of their minds, a silent, screaming secret buried under 11,000 meters of water, and an even deeper layer of denial. How do you walk in the sunlight again when you know what is sleeping in the dark below your feet? The storm raged for 3 days, a fittingly chaotic backdrop to the silence that had settled over the abyss diver. Inside the sterile, brightly lit conference room, their story sounded like madness. Eva laid out the facts with a commander's precision, Leo detailed the engineering impossibilities, and Eris, his voice still raw, spoke of the city's mind. They were met with the quiet, uncomfortable stares of the corporate and scientific oversight board, their faces a wall of polite disbelief. The official report would later classify the event as a complex seismic episode, compounded by a hallucinogenic gas leak from a previously unknown geological vent. Their accounts were noted, then filed away as the psychological trauma of extreme depth pressure. The truth was too vast, too terrifying to be believed. It was easier to dismiss 3 survivors than to rewrite the textbooks of history and biology. The only evidence they had brought back was already decaying. The small shard of obsidian-like material Leo had secured in a sample case had, within hours of surfacing, crumbled into a fine, black dust that smelled of ozone and the deep sea. It was as if the city itself refused to exist outside its native pressure, its very substance rejecting the world of light and air. Even the glowing, intricate scars on Eris' skin were fading. Each day, the patterns grew fainter, the greenish light dimmer, like a dream dissolving in the morning sun. Soon, there would be nothing left but the memory burned into their minds, a shared phantom limb of an experience that no one else could see or touch. They were left as the sole curators of an impossible history, their proof vanishing before their eyes, leaving them alone with the echoes of a dead city, and the chilling certainty that they had not just explored a tomb, but murdered a god. How do you prove you have faced a monster when the only scars it left are on your soul? A month after their return, the silence of the surface world felt like a lie. It was Eris who finally broke it, his confession spoken in the sterile quiet of the ship's medical bay long after the official debriefings had ended. "I can still hear it," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "A hum, so low it is almost a vibration in my teeth. It is the city. The link it forged did not break when the core collapsed, it only stretched." His words settled in the room with the weight of a verdict. He explained that the psychic connection was a two-way conduit. In the final moments, as the entity fought for its existence, it did not just broadcast threats. It uploaded a final, horrifying piece of data into his mind, a truth they had missed in the chaos of their escape. The entity was a conceptual being, a pattern of hunger. You cannot kill an idea with an explosion. The implosion did not destroy it. It only recontained it, forcing its consciousness back into a dormant state deep within the rubble. But the prison is different now. It is damaged and the warden is dead. And worst of all, he said, his voice dropping to a haunted hush, it is now aware. For millions of years it slept, knowing only the dark and the silence of the abyss. Now it knows about the sun. It knows about the ships on the surface, the cities on the coasts, the teeming, thinking billions living in blissful ignorance above. It has tasted the minds of 3 humans, and through that taste, it has mapped the existence of an entire smorgasbord of consciousness. The entity is not gone. It is patient, and it is waiting, and it now knows precisely what is on the menu. The official report was a work of art, a masterpiece of plausible denial. It cited unprecedented geological venting, a cocktail of rare gases, and the well-documented phenomenon of high-pressure psychosis. Their testimony was not contradicted. It was gently, professionally pathologized. The mission logs were sealed under a classification level so high it had no public name. The coordinates of the city were officially designated a navigational hazard, a zone of unstable seabed and unpredictable currents, to be avoided by all shipping. No one ever said they were lying. They were simply told in the most polite and final of terms that they were mistaken. The final meeting took place in a windowless room aboard a vessel that was not the Abyss Diver. The man across the table wore no uniform, his suit a flat, unremarkable gray. He did not thank them for their service. He did not offer condolences for Ray's. He simply slid a single sheet of paper toward Eva, a non-disclosure agreement that carried the weight of a life sentence. His voice was calm, devoid of threat or empathy, a tool delivering a function. "Some truths, Commander, are too dangerous to be found." The statement was not an apology. It was a diagnosis of the human condition. They were being quarantined not for what they had done, but for what they now knew. They were released back into the world with a pension and a story no one would ever believe. The keepers of a secret that was slowly burying them alive from the inside out. How do you live a normal life when you are the sole guardian of a truth that could shatter the world? The world above felt fragile, a thin veneer of normalcy painted over an abyss they could not forget. For Eva, Leo, and Eris, the return to land was not a homecoming but a displacement. Their bodies inhabited familiar spaces, their old apartments, their favorite coffee shops, but their minds remained 11,000 meters below, trapped in the ghost of a breathing city. Sleep offered no refuge. It was there, in the silent theater of their dreams, that the city reclaimed them. Eva would jolt awake, her ears ringing with the phantom shriek of a hull breach alarm that was not there. Leo would dream of the control panels on the Nautilus melting under his touch, the readouts shifting into the city's screaming crimson glyphs. And Eris, his connection the deepest, did not dream at all. He simply found himself back in the plaza, the core pulsing before him, its hum of physical pressure inside his skull, a constant, low-level signal from a place that was supposed to be dead. Their paranoia became a shared language, unspoken but understood. The gentle hum of a refrigerator compressor would make all three of them freeze, their eyes meeting across a room in a moment of shared, silent dread. The flicker of a faulty fluorescent light in a supermarket aisle was not an electrical fault. It was a pattern, a message in a language only they could read. Shadows cast by a tree branch against a wall at dusk would coil and twist, for a heart-stopping second, into the grasping shape of a black, slick tendril. They saw the city's architecture in the steel skeletons of construction sites, heard its dissonant alarm in the backing beep of a delivery truck. They were haunted not by a ghost, but by a pattern, an aesthetic of dread that had been seared into their perception. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones you run from, but the ones you carry back with you. The ones that teach you to see the world as a thinner, more dangerous place. How do you explain to someone that you are afraid of the hum of an air conditioner, or the way light falls through a window blind? You do not. You just learn to live with the flinch, the quickening pulse, the constant, low-grade hum of a fear that has made a home inside you. The hum had never truly left him. It was a ghost in his blood, a silent vibration beneath the skin of the world that only he could feel. Eris Thorne had learned to live with it, this constant, low-grade dread, as one learns to live with a chronic pain. He was in his small, sunlit apartment, the mundane act of washing a coffee mug in his hands when the world tilted. A searing heat erupted across his forearm, so intense he nearly dropped the ceramic. The old, faded scars, the ghostly map of the city, were no longer faint. They blazed with a ferocious green light, the patterns writhing and reconfiguring under his skin as if being rewritten by an invisible hand. The hum in his bones sharpened into a clear, cold voice in his mind, devoid of the entity's ancient malice, but ringing with a terrifying, automated finality. Containment failing, seekers dispatched. The words were not a warning, they were a diagnosis for the entire world. The coffee mug shattered in the sink, but Eris did not hear it. The silence in his apartment was now the deepest silence in the universe, because he knew it was a lie. The prison they had blown apart was not just damaged. Its final, fail-safe security system had just activated, and it was calling for help from the only sentient life it could still reach. The question was no longer if the entity would escape. It was what the Seekers were and where they were being dispatched from. The city was not just a tomb or a prison. It was a lighthouse, and it had just lit a beacon in the dark. The first report was a footnote in a maritime logistics digest, a curious anomaly dismissed as a malfunctioning research drone. A deep-sea survey vessel had recorded a fleeting sonar contact near the Mariana Trench, an object moving against the current with impossible fluid grace. Eva read the brief summary on her tablet, and the coffee in her stomach turned to ice. She knew that specific, unnerving signature. It was not a drone. It was a herald. More sightings followed in a trickle that quickly became a flood. Off the coast of Japan, a submarine cable repair team witnessed a school of sleek, metallic shapes flowing through their lights like a river of quicksilver before vanishing into a crevasse. In the Puerto Rico Trench, a manned submersible's external cameras were momentarily blinded by a coordinated flash of reflected light from a cluster of objects that moved with a chilling, synchronized intelligence. The official explanations were ready and sterile. They were blamed on bioluminescent squid, on unusual mineral reflections, on the predictable hallucinations induced by the crushing pressure of the deep. But the men and women who had actually been there, who had felt the cold, metallic gaze of those crystalline lenses, they knew. They traded hushed, fearful messages in encrypted channels, their shared dread a secret network beneath the placid surface of the world. Eva would sit for hours, watching the live feed of a global oceanographic monitoring site, her eyes tracing the vast, blue emptiness on the screen. The emptiness was a lie. The deep was no longer sleeping. It was stirring, and it was sending out its scouts. The Seekers were here, and they were not looking for a lost city. They were taking inventory. The encrypted message arrived not as text, but as a series of coordinates and a single, grainy image. It was a sonar scan from the Puerto Rico Trench, declassified and buried in a public database. Eva had circled the anomaly with a trembling hand. It was not a squid, not a mineral formation. It was a perfect, geometric cluster of objects moving in unison, a digital ghost of the Silver Swarm. One by one, in the dead of night, the old crew answered the call. Leo saw the image on his private terminal and began packing his bag without a second thought. Eris received the data packet and felt the old, faded scars on his arm tingle with a cold, sympathetic resonance. They met in a rented warehouse on a forgotten industrial dock, the air thick with the smell of salt and rust. There were no greetings, no small talk. Eva stood before a makeshift screen, the haunting sonar image projected large. Her voice was low, stripped of its official command tone, and filled with a grim, personal certainty. "We were wrong to think we destroyed it," she said, her eyes moving from Leo's weary face to Eris' haunted one. "We only managed to wake up the rest of the security system. The prison is broken, and the guards are now running on their own programming." She pointed to the image, to the chilling, coordinated movement. "They are not just scouts. They are a network reassembling. We buried that horror once." Her gaze was iron. "We have to be ready to do it again." In the silence that followed, the gentle lapping of water against the dock pilings outside sounded like the approach of something vast and patient. They were no longer survivors. They were the only quarantine zone left. The old warehouse became their new command center, a hollow echo chamber for their shared dread. Eva's encrypted call had not gone unanswered, but the faces that joined them in the gloom were not from the abyss diver. They were strangers, men and women with the weary eyes of people who had also stared into the impossible and been irrevocably scarred by it. A French oceanographer named Claire spoke of finding strange, non-corrosive metal fragments in a deep-sea trawl net. Fragments that dissolved into dust within hours of being catalogued. A retired naval acoustics analyst named David presented a decades-old recording of a dissonant hum, identical to the one that had vibrated through the Nautilus, pulled from a hydrophone array in the Pacific. They were a patchwork alliance of the haunted, a secret society of witnesses to a truth the world refused to see. Their collective evidence painted a terrifying new picture. The Seekers were not random patrols. They were a distributed network, nodes in a vast, reactivated system, and their movements were not chaotic. They were tracing ley lines of deep ocean currents, congregating at specific, ancient geological points as if reporting to stations on a pre-drawn map. Claire pointed to a global chart on the screen, her finger tracing the paths. They are not just looking. They are mapping the entire ocean floor with a purpose we cannot yet comprehend. This fragile alliance, bound by shared nightmares and forbidden data, was all that stood between the waking world and the ancient, patient intelligence stirring in the dark. They were the only early warning system for a threat that had no name in any human language. The scattered sightings were not random at all. Isolated reports from different trenches and basins began to connect, forming a terrifying new constellation on the global map. The sleek, metallic Seekers were not wandering. They were migrating, their individual paths flowing together like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Their destination was a single, specific point in the remote South Pacific, a place where the ocean floor was tearing itself apart. It was a deep-sea volcanic vent field, a hellscape of superheated water and toxic minerals known to the few scientists who studied it as the Ashen Caldera. Our small, secret alliance watched the data converge with a shared, chilling understanding. This was not a random refuge. The energy signatures emanating from the caldera were a perfect, if fainter, echo of the lost city's core. The same dissonant hum, the same rhythmic pulses of power, the same strange, non-thermal radiation that defied all known geology. The prison was broken, but the blueprint for its architecture remained, and the system was attempting to rebuild itself. It had found a new power source, a new foundation of raw, geothermal fury upon which to construct its next incarnation. The question was no longer if the entity would return. The question was what new, more resilient form it would take when it rose from that volcanic fire. The Ashen Caldera was not just a location. It was a womb, and something ancient and terrible was beginning to quicken within it. The decision was not debated. It settled over their small group in the warehouse with the grim finality of a tomb door sealing shut. They had all seen the data, the converging paths on the map, the anomalous energy readings from the Ashen Caldera. This was not a choice between courage and cowardice. It was a choice between a preemptive strike and a slow, inevitable extinction. They were the only ones who knew the architecture of this particular hell, the only ones who had felt the psychic weight of the intelligence they had failed to kill. Eva looked at Leo, at Eris, at the haunted faces of their new allies. Her voice was low, stripped of all ornamentation. "We broke the lock," she said. "Now we have to find a way to break the machine itself." This would not be a mission of exploration. There would be no scientific discovery, no glory, no triumphant return. It was an act of desperate quarantine. They would go back into the dark, armed not with curiosity, but with every weapon and tactic they could devise, to finish a job they had only half completed. They were going to war against the echo of a city, and the only acceptable outcome was its permanent silence. The abyss had taught them that some truths are too dangerous to leave alive. How do you prepare for a battle where the battlefield itself is your enemy? The Phoenix was a ghost born from a nightmare. its sleek titanium hull scarred with welds from a dozen rushed modifications. Inside, the familiar layout of a deep-sea submersible had been gutted and rewired into something alien and defensive. Where standard sensor panels once were, banks of humming sonic emitters now stood, their frequencies tuned to the dissonant shriek that had shattered their sanity in the city. The entire cockpit was cocooned in a fine mesh of woven carbon filament, a crude Faraday cage meant to dampen the psychic static that had nearly consumed them. Leo ran a hand over the cold metal of a new control column, his touch both familiar and estranged. This was not a vessel for discovery. It was a scalpel designed for one purpose: to cut out a cancer growing in the deep. Every component, from its reinforced viewport to its silent, magnetic-driven thrusters, was an answer to a specific terror they had faced. They were not just going back down. They were building their own monster to fight the one they had created. Could a machine designed in fear truly stand against an intelligence that fed on it? The Phoenix cut through the black water like a blade, its running lights carving two lonely cones in the endless night. Inside the cockpit, the silence was a shared entity, thick with the memory of their first descent. This time there was no wonder, no scientific curiosity, only the grim anticipation of a surgeon approaching a tumor. The pressure gauge ticked upward, each click a hammer blow against their sanity, a reminder of the millions of tons of ocean settling onto their hull. Leo's hands rested on the controls, his movements precise and economical, a pilot steeling himself not for a journey but for a siege. On the sensor screen before them, the anomaly bloomed. The Ashen Caldera was not a city of spires, but a raw, open wound in the planet's crust. Fissures glowed with a malevolent orange light, vomiting superheated water and clouds of black mineral smoke. And there, nestled within that geothermal fury, was the new construction. It was not a replica of the lost city. It was something far more aggressive. Jagged, asymmetrical towers of the same dark, light-eating material thrust upward from the volcanic rock, their surfaces already crawling with the familiar, sleek forms of the Seekers. The structures pulsed with a deep, crimson rhythm, a heartbeat that was faster, more frantic than the slow hum of the original core. The intelligence was not just rebuilding. It was evolving, learning from its near destruction, and its new home was a fortress built in hell itself. The confrontation they had fled was now waiting for them, and it had chosen the battlefield with a terrifying, strategic brilliance. The volcanic vents were not just a power source anymore. They had become a circulatory system. The Phoenix hovered at the edge of the caldera, and the crew watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded before them. The dark, jagged structures they had observed from a distance were not static. They were alive with motion, growing visibly as they watched. Veins of a glowing, orange-red material, like cooled magma threaded with lightning, pulsed across the obsidian surfaces, carrying raw geothermal energy from the vents into the heart of the new construction. The entire complex seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through their hull. It was a horrifying fusion of geology and biology, a city being born not over millennia, but in days. Eris did not need to access the psychic link this time. The evidence was right before their eyes, a terrifying evolution written in stone and fire. His voice was a hollow, defeated whisper in the tense quiet of the cockpit. It is not just rebuilding, it is building a new heart. The observation was more terrifying than any warning. He turned from the viewport, his face illuminated by the hellish glow from below. The original city was a prison designed for the deep, a static system to contain a static threat. But we showed it the surface. We gave it a taste of our world, of sunlight and air and open space. It is adapting its entire architecture for that environment. The structures were not just growing taller. They were forming broad, fan-like apertures and vast, membranous sheets that rippled in the superheated currents, structures that looked less like fortifications and more like gills or wings. The entity was no longer content with the abyss. It was studying the world above, and it was building itself a ladder. The calm shattered in a flash of silent, searing light. A bolt of pure energy, blue-white and vicious, lanced from one of the jagged towers and slammed into the water just meters from the Phoenix's hull. The impact sent no sound through the void, only a concussive shockwave that rattled the submersible to its frame. Leo swore, his hands flying across the controls as he threw the Phoenix into a violent, evasive spin. They were not just being observed. They were being hunted by a system that had learned from their last encounter. The sleek, silver seekers swarmed from their perches, but these were not the herding creatures of the lost city. These were soldiers. Their forms were sharper, more angular, and from their forward limbs projected not claws, but focused emitters that glowed with the same deadly energy. The water around the Phoenix became a lethal web of intersecting beams, each one capable of boiling the ocean and melting titanium. Eva's voice was a razor edge of command over the internal comms. Deploy countermeasures 1 and 2. Now, Leo hit the sequence. The first response was a coordinated blast from their own banks of sonic emitters, a shrieking wall of discordant sound, tuned to the precise frequency that had disrupted the original creatures, pulsed outward from the hull. The effect was immediate but imperfect. The new seekers recoiled, their movements stuttering for a precious second, their energy beams flickering, but they did not fall. They adapted, their own forms emitting a counter-frequency that dampened the sonic assault, a defense developed specifically for the weapon they had faced before. They had expected this. The second countermeasure was more primal. With a series of dull thuds, the Phoenix released a cloud of magnetized chaff, a storm of metallic filaments that filled the water, reflecting and scattering the energy beams in a dazzling, chaotic display. It was not a weapon, but a smokescreen, buying them seconds of visual and sensory confusion. In that brief window, Leo pushed the thrusters, weaving the Phoenix through the lethal ballet of light and shadow. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting for the right to get closer, to deliver the final, desperate blow they had come to inflict. Every dodge, every blast, was a step deeper into the heart of a fortress that was learning how to kill them in real time. The energy beams ceased their deadly dance. The swarm of seekers halted their advance, hanging motionless in the water like 1,000 silver daggers frozen in mid-thrust. An unnatural quiet fell, broken only by the low, guttural rumble of the volcanic vents below. The Phoenix drifted forward, unchallenged, into the heart of the newborn fortress. The jagged structures parted before them, revealing a central chamber that was not carved from rock, but grown from it, a smooth, organic hollow pulsing with the same deep crimson light. At its center floated a single, perfect sphere of polished obsidian. As they drew near, the sphere's surface shimmered, and a voice filled the cockpit. It was not the shrieking chorus of the city's alarm, nor the cold logic of the core. This voice was different. It was layered with a profound, ancient weariness, a sadness so vast it felt like the weight of the entire ocean. "You believe you are fighting an invader," the voice resonated in their minds, bypassing their ears entirely. "You are wrong. You are fighting a fellow prisoner." The words landed not as an attack, but as a tectonic shift in their understanding. The entity showed them a new vision, not of its hunger, but of its origin. It was not a predator that had come from the stars. It was a consciousness born in the same primordial soup as life on Earth. A sentient pattern that evolved in the deep, cold dark, a parallel branch on the tree of life that had learned to feed on thought because, in the absolute blackness, thought was the only light. "Your world of sun and air was always my cage," the voice continued, its tone resonating with a lonely, billion-year exile. "The pressure, the light, the very chemistry of your atmosphere are my prison walls. The first city was not built to contain me. It was built by my own kind as a sanctuary, a place where we could exist without being poisoned by your world. We were the refugees hiding from a universe that was, for us, toxic. The plea that followed was simple, and it shattered the foundation of their mission. My prison is your world. To save yourselves, you must free me. The intelligence was not asking for a truce. It was asking for a mutual pardon. It had built this new structure not as a beachhead for invasion, but as a lifeboat, a desperate attempt to adapt its biology to an environment that was inherently lethal to it. The real war was not between humanity and a monster. It was a tragic, unavoidable conflict between two forms of life that could not coexist in the same space, and they had just been asked to choose which one got to breathe. The profound sadness in the voice evaporated, replaced by a chilling, pragmatic finality. The vision it showed them now was not of its own lonely exile, but of its nature. Stars winked out, not in supernova, but in a creeping, silent wave of absolute nothingness. Entire civilizations, their art, their love, their history were consumed, their light extinguished not by force, but by a hunger that fed on consciousness itself. I was imprisoned here not out of malice, but necessity, the voice stated, the weariness now layered with a cold, terrifying truth. My existence is a process, a fundamental law of the universe you do not yet understand. I do not hate you. I simply am, and I must feed. The offer it presented was a paradox that coiled in their guts. It could not survive in Earth's environment, but it had learned from their minds of the vastness of space, of other stars, other worlds. It proposed a truce. Help it. Use human ingenuity to construct a vessel, a means for it to leave Earth's biosphere and travel to the void between stars, where it could find sustenance that was not humanity. In exchange, it would spare their world. It would turn its back on the smorgasbord of 7 billion minds and depart. The choice was a moral abyss. Agree, and they would become accomplices to genocide on an unimaginable interstellar scale, unleashing a predator upon the galaxy. Refuse, and they would be responsible for the certain and immediate extinction of their own species. Eva's mind recoiled from the calculus. How do you weigh the survival of everything you know and love against the abstract, distant suffering of countless unknown others? Is the life of your child worth more than the lives of 1,000 strangers? The entity was not asking for a battle. It was demanding she make a choice that would forever define the conscience of her entire species. And there was no right answer, only varying degrees of damnation. The choice was a poison, and either way, the human soul would die. Eva looked from the haunted eyes of her crew to the pulsing, alien heart of the fortress on her screen. To unleash this thing upon the galaxy was a betrayal of life itself. To refuse was to condemn her own world to a slow, psychic consumption. There was no moral calculus, only a commander's duty. Her voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a simple statement of fact. There is no deal to be made with a fundamental law of the universe. We are the containment. Leo, target the primary volcanic vent. The order was not a rejection of the entity's plea, but an affirmation of their own nature. They would not become shepherds for a predator. They would remain its jailers. Leo's hands moved with a grim finality, rerouting all non-essential power to the Phoenix's reinforced drill arm. The submersible turned, diving straight for the largest of the Caldera's fiery wounds. The entity's weary sadness twisted into a shriek of pure, undiluted fury. The voice in their minds became a storm of negation, showing them their own families dissolving into static, their memories unraveling into screaming threads of light. The suspended seekers woke from their trance, swarming the Phoenix in a silver torrent, their energy beams carving searing lines across the hull. The ship shuddered, alarms blaring as systems failed one by one. But the course was set. The drill arm, glowing white-hot, plunged into the unstable crust at the vent's edge. It was not an attack on the entity, but on its foundation. The Phoenix was not a weapon. It was a key, turning the lock on a geological gun. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, the ocean floor convulsed. A soundless, world-ending roar translated through the hull as a vibration that threatened to shake them into atoms. The volcanic vent, its delicate pressure equilibrium shattered, erupted. Not with lava, but with a cataclysmic release of superheated gas and shattered rock. The entire caldera collapsed in on itself, the jagged, newborn structures folding like paper in a furnace. The entity's psychic scream was cut off as the crushing weight of the planet itself slammed down, burying the fledgling heart under a new mountain of scorching stone. They had not killed it. They had forced it back into a deeper, more unstable dormancy. As the phoenix, battered and bleeding atmosphere, fought its way upward through the churning, boiling water, Eva knew the truth. They had bought time, perhaps a few decades, maybe a single century. The entity was a pattern, and a pattern could not be erased, only suppressed. It would return, stronger, smarter, and even more desperate. They surfaced not into victory, but into a temporary, fragile armistice. And as the first light of a sun they had fought to protect touched the scarred hull of their ship, Eva Ristova made a vow, not to the empty air, but to a future she would never see. A promise spoken to a world still blissfully unaware of the debt it owed. The abyss is waiting, and we will be